So, the spoilers are out for My Hero Academia Manga Chapter 354, and in this chapter, we get a really interesting surprise when it comes to the fight that goes on in this chapter between All For One, Hawks, and Endeavor, and you'll see what I mean right after this. Hey guys, how's it going? It is your boy, Manga Man Drew, and I'm here to cover the spoilers for My Hero Academia Manga Chapter 354, and from what we see later on in the spoilers, apparently the title of this chapter is right here! And from what we see with the spoilers so far, we are actually focusing on the fight between All For One versus Endeavor and Hawks, as we get a little bit more and we get to see a lot more of that actual fight, showing that from what we're getting with this story, most likely than not, we're going to be focusing on different aspects of each and every location on specific fights, and we're going to stick to those fights in these certain areas. And you'll see more of that in the chapter spoilers, but overall, it's just a big fight, so let's dive right into what the spoilers have to say about it. Because, from what we see with the spoilers, the chapter begins with Hawks and Genus discussing All For One's greatest weakness, the mask. Stain's stolen records from Tartarus allowed them to see that he escaped from the prison while carrying that huge chair, so he needs these breathing apparatus to stay alive. Therefore, their strategy was based on gathering a small number of heroes with considerable offensive power to strike in sequence and destroy the mask. Back to the present, we see Endeavor and Hawks advancing with everything. All For One throws air slashes, but Endeavor blocks them with Hail Cutting, giving Hawks a chance to throw some feathers that catch fire and fly towards All For One. So this is very interesting because from what we're getting with the spoilers, this chapter is going to be focusing on the fight between All For One as well as Endeavor and Hawks, but that the main purpose of this fight is not necessarily to defeat All For One, but to try and break his helmet to try and, in a way, suffocate him and prevent him from breathing. Which kind of makes sense because if you can't really defeat him physically, defeat him by causing him to not breathe anymore. So it's cool that that is going to be the premise of this fight and that it's not necessarily to defeat All For One with full force. And as we see within the next line of text spoilers, All For One is not allowing for the heroes to have it their way because All For One realizes where they are aiming and blocks the feathers. Hawks tries to attack from behind with his feather sword, but All For One uses the goo that comes out of his fingers to stop him. He continues to taunt, saying that even Recovery Girl wasn't able to get his wings back to their former glory, but Hawks just laughs and says that both him and All For One are already way past their prime. Endeavor joins them and begins to strike with a sequence of vanishing fists. All For One thinks to himself that since it's a heat-based attack, he can't use the damage reverse quirk to protect himself. He assumes that the two of them will coordinate their attacks, but realizes that Endeavor is a little out of sync and makes a point of saying so out loud so they can hear. So from what we see with this spoilers, as well as a little bit later on, All For One knows what their plan is, and he's doing the All For One thing by taunting them, trying to distract them to give them more of a disadvantage when fighting him. So that's something interesting that we're seeing, and that this is something that All For One has done and does regularly in the series, talking and monologuing and basically smack talking his opponents so that they could eventually make a mistake, or he can find an opening and take advantage of it, which we're going to see that he does in this chapter potentially. Because later on with the text spoilers, we see that All For One continues to make fun of Endeavor, saying that everyone in this war is playing their part. They're all giving their best against the enemies in front of them, so it's not fair that only he has his head somewhere else. In fact, he should be happy that the masterpiece got rid of the defective product. Endeavor gets angrier, but Hawks yells at him not to listen and asks him to remember what happened to All Might and Camino when he fell for those provocations. That's when All For One says that long ago, he was already keeping an eye on the result of Endeavor's relentless search for power. He's the kind of guy who doesn't miss a chance to plant a seed when he finds good soil. And then here comes the final blow. You didn't find Toya's body back in the day, did you? So yeah, this is information that we as the readers knew prior, but All For One is using this information to his advantage to try and trigger Endeavor to attack recklessly, which he kind of does, because from what we see with the next line of text spoilers, Hawks realizes that this is not good at all and comes to a conclusion that someone like Endeavor, who has decided to go on living to pay for his mistakes, is fundamentally different from Hawks himself, who has turned his back on his mother and father. He would not, in fact, have been able to face Dabi right now, so this team division was the right choice, and he has to do everything he can to support Endeavor. Hawks flies off in the direction of the two and tries to remind Endeavor to keep a cool head, that their mission is to destroy the mask. But that was too late, because right after Endeavor yells All For One, he receives an attack right on the side of his torso. All For One has turned his hand into some creepy mouth with thorns and says, "Right here, you lowered your defenses." And this is very interesting, mainly because this is probably a similar attack that happened with All Might that led to potentially his guts coming out of his body. But also, they make a reference to what happened in Kamino, where we get All For One taking advantage of the emotions of Endeavor and of All Might, and then striking a decisive hit against Endeavor, potentially hurting him and maiming him severely. And from what we see with the text spoilers, this is where the title of the chapter comes in right here, because Hawks shouts out Endeavor's name and tries to go to help, but All For One directs his hands at him and says that at this distance, the quote-unquote Nagant replacement would not be able to dodge. When all seems lost, heartbeat wall, Jiro arrives riding Tokoyami. So this is where the chapter gets really interesting, because it's going to be showing, from what we see in the spoilers, that Jiro as well as Tokoyami are going to be playing a part in fighting against All For One and potentially playing a role in breaking his mask. As we're getting to the final chunks of the text spoilers, where we see that Jiro apparently asks Tokoyami not to swing too much because she hasn't gotten used to flying yet, and the situation there is very tense. Hawks is in shock and says that they shouldn't be there, that if they don't run away soon, they'll die. Tokoyami ignores the warning and says that although he's not as strong as Endeavor, he'll stay there to synchronize his attacks with Hawks. All For One calls the two of them insects that fly around one for all, and says that in the comic book he read with his brother, several of the secondary characters were killed by the Demon King. Jiro tells him to leave the fiddle faddle to after he has defeated them. End of chapter. So there's a lot to say about this part of the chapter. Let's start off with the idea that Jiro and Tokoyami aren't afraid of All For One, the fact that they're going to get involved in fighting All For One, and potentially that All For One, as well as Hirokoshi to a certain extent, is foreshadowing that certain secondary characters are going to be killed. So I'm probably going to talk about that more in the actual review and what that could entail for the story and an expectation that Hirokoshi is making for the story. But all we need to know is that in this chapter, we're seeing that the students are actually going to go up against All For One, or at the very least, they're going to be providing support for Hawks, for Endeavor, so that one of the two, specifically Endeavor, will be able to break All For One's mask and eventually lead to his defeat. But potentially All For One has some other plan up his sleeves, because he always does. But as we see right now, this is what the plan is going to be. They're going to break the mask and try to defeat All For One that way, because most likely than not, they cannot overpower him. So yeah, that's pretty much all the spoilers that we have for right now. This is going to be a very interesting chapter, and I can't wait to do a more proper review of the chapter when the translations and the actual clearer manga panels are out for me to do the review. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more content like this, leave a comment down below telling me if you want to see more My Hero Academia reviews, and don't forget to like this video if you like this type of content, and subscribe to my YouTube channel to get more content like this. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!